The sirens cut through the quiet hum of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Oak Ridge, a suburban enclave that prided itself on manicured lawns and quiet streets and a general air of undisturbed peace. But the real crime wasn't being announced by those wailing sirens. The real crime was happening behind the badge. Power has a funny way of blinding those who wield it recklessly. It twists their perception until they believe they are untouchable. When an arrogant patrolman decided to assert his dominance over a disabled black veteran merely trying to cross the street, he expected absolute compliance. He expected fear. Instead, he met a pair of cold, unblinking eyes that had stared down organized crime syndicates and international terrorists. One bad decision, fueled by prejudice, set off an explosive chain reaction that would completely obliterate a corrupted career. For Azariah Hughes, it was supposed to be just another day. At 60 years old, Azariah had traded the relentless adrenaline-soaked concrete canyons of Washington, D.C. for the slow, predictable rhythm of this Midwestern town. After 30 years of federal service, 3 decades spent investigating organized crime and money laundering and international terrorism, he had earned the right to fade quietly into the background. He had traded the weight of national security for the simplicity of small-town life. Sunlight baked the pavement of Elm Street as Azariah navigated the sidewalk with the practiced ease of a man who had long accepted his physical limitations. His motorized wheelchair hummed quietly, a steady mechanical companion that had replaced the use of his legs a decade prior. The chair moved at his command, responsive and reliable. Azariah was a man carved from mahogany and granite. Even seated, his posture was immaculately straight. His shoulders were broad beneath a crisp, light blue button-down shirt. Silver peppered his close-cropped hair and neat beard, framing a face lined not just by age, but by the heavy burdens of a life spent peering into the darkest corners of human nature. He had a serene, resting expression, though his dark eyes missed nothing. They constantly scanned his environment, a lingering habit from 30 years of federal service. He tracked the delivery truck turning the corner 3 blocks away. He tracked the stray dog sniffing a fire hydrant. He tracked the young mother pushing a stroller near the park. It was an involuntary reflex, the ghost of an operational mindset that refused to entirely fade even in retirement. Today's mission was simple and mundane. A trip to the local corner grocer to pick up fresh basil and a newspaper. He held a small, reusable canvas bag on his lap, enjoying the gentle afternoon breeze. Oak Ridge was supposed to be safe. It was the kind of town where people nodded to each other on the street, where neighbors knew each other's names, where violence seemed like something that happened in other places, on the news, in distant cities, far from here. But Azariah knew better than most that trouble rarely announced itself with trumpets. It usually arrived dressed in the mundane, wearing a smile, carrying authority. 3 miles away, cruising down a commercial strip with no particular purpose, sat Officer Bradley Jenkins. Jenkins was 34 years old, thick-necked. He carried himself with a permanent tight-jawed scowl that he mistook for authority. He gripped the steering wheel of his police cruiser with white knuckles, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the passing storefronts. His uniform fit him like armor, or perhaps like a costume he had perfected over years of practice. To Jenkins, the uniform was not a symbol of public service. It was a license. It was a shield that justified his worst impulses. It had become so second nature to him that he no longer saw the distinction between his authority and his prejudice. They were one and the same in his mind. Beside him sat Officer Thomas Miller, a 23-year-old rookie fresh out of the academy, still possessing the naive belief that the job was entirely about helping people, about making a real difference. He had joined the police force because he wanted to protect his community. He was still young enough to believe that was possible. Miller was currently shifting uncomfortably in the passenger seat, sweating through his uniform, largely because his training officer had been ranting for the past 20 minutes about everything that was wrong with the town, and more specifically, everything that was wrong with the people Jenkins believed didn't belong there. You see, Miller Jenkins barked his voice a gravelly sneer that cut through the hum of the air conditioning. It's about establishing the baseline. These people come into our town. They think they can just loiter. Bring down the property values. Act like they own the place. You give them an inch, they take a mile. You have to show them who holds the leash. Miller swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. He stared out the window, watching the neighborhood pass by. Each storefront and street corner was a blur of the ordinary world that seemed to exist in a completely different reality from the one Jenkins inhabited. "Who?" Miller asked quietly, his voice tentative. "Who exactly do you mean, sir?" Jenkins let out a sharp, humorless bark of laughter that sounded almost like a growl. "Don't play dumb, kid. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The element. The ones who don't belong here. You can spot them a mile away. They don't respect the law until you make them respect it." What Miller didn't know was that Jenkins had a personnel file that read like a master class in borderline misconduct. 14 excessive force complaints in 6 years. 9 of them involved minorities. All of them had been mysteriously dismissed or settled quietly by a police union that protected its own, enabling his escalating behavior. The union didn't ask questions. The union didn't investigate. The union simply paid settlements and made problems disappear. Chief Robert Harrison, a stern old-school lawman who actually believed in justice, had repeatedly tried to find the smoking gun needed to strip Jenkins of his badge. But the patrolman was cunning. He knew where the camera blind spots were. He knew how to write a report that painted the victim as the aggressor. He knew the system inside and out. Had learned it through years of walking the edge between what was legal and what was simply not prosecutable. Jenkins survived on technicalities and a deeply ingrained departmental reluctance to admit they had a bad apple rotting the barrel. "Just watch and learn," Miller Jenkins muttered, accelerating the cruiser past the speed limit just because he could. Just because nobody would pull over a police officer for speeding. Today you're going to see how real police work gets done. No more of that textbook garbage they fed you at the academy. Back on Elm Street, Azariah approached the intersection of 4th Avenue. The pedestrian crossing light glowed a steady white silhouette. The walking figure illuminated against the dark background of the signal box. He checked both ways, a lifelong habit that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous work. Then he engaged the joystick on his right armrest. The wheelchair rolled smoothly off the curb ramp and onto the asphalt. The tires gripped the pavement with quiet authority. He was halfway across the street when the canvas bag on his lap slipped. The shift was subtle, just a slight angle, but gravity is unforgiving. A small jar of expensive artisanal honey he had bought as a treat rolled off his lap and shattered on the pavement, spreading golden syrup in glass across the white lines of the crosswalk. The jar had been a gift to himself, a small luxury that represented the simple pleasures of retirement. Azariah sighed, a sound of mild annoyance. He stopped the chair in the middle of the road, putting it in park with a soft click, and carefully leaned forward to assess the mess. He couldn't easily bend down to clean it himself. His disability meant that certain physical movements required careful planning and effort. But he didn't want a car to puncture a tire on the thick glass shards. He reached into his side pouch to grab a small rag, intending to push the larger pieces toward the gutter. At that exact moment, the roaring engine of a police cruiser turned onto 4th Avenue. Officer Bradley Jenkins was at the wheel. Jenkins slammed on the brakes. The cruiser's tires squealed in protest as the heavy vehicle lurched to a halt merely 10 feet from Azariah's wheelchair. The sudden aggressive stop sent a jolt of adrenaline through the rookie Miller, who braced his hands against the dashboard, his eyes widening in shock at his training officer's recklessness. "What is this idiot doing?" Jenkins snarled, his face instantly flushing with unwarranted anger. The rage came so quickly, so automatically, as if his body was designed to produce it. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel horn, letting out a prolonged, deafening blast that shattered the quiet suburban afternoon like a hammer striking glass. Azariah flinched slightly at the jarring noise, but he did not panic. He had heard worse in his lifetime. He had heard gunshots and explosions and the screams of people in danger. A car horn was nothing. He slowly straightened his posture, turning his head to look over his shoulder at the cruiser. He raised one hand in a calm, apologetic gesture, pointing down at the shattered glass and the spilled honey, signaling that he was temporarily delayed. His face was composed. His movements were deliberate. Every gesture said, "I am not a threat. I am not being defiant. I am simply handling a minor inconvenience." To a reasonable observer, the situation would have been crystal clear. An elderly, disabled man had dropped something and was figuring out how to manage it. An elderly man doing what elderly men do, being careful, being thoughtful, trying not to cause trouble for others. To Officer Bradley Jenkins, it was an egregious act of defiance. It was a black man in a wheelchair holding up his road, refusing to instantly scatter at the sound of a police horn. It was a challenge to his authority. It was everything Jenkins hated about the world. Someone who didn't immediately obey, who didn't know their place, who had the audacity to exist in his space without permission. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Jenkins growled, unbuckling his seatbelt with violent speed. The belt snapped back with a sharp click. "Look at this guy. Thinks he owns the damn street. Probably intoxicated or looking for a payout." "Sir, he's in a wheelchair." Miller started, his voice trembling slightly with a mixture of confusion and concern. "It looks like he dropped something." "Shut up, Miller." Jenkins snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the air of the cramped cruiser. "I'm handling this." He kicked the cruiser door open. Actually kicked it, a gesture of pure aggression, and stormed out into the afternoon heat, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his service weapon. An intimidation tactic he used as naturally as breathing. So automatic that he probably didn't even realize he was doing it anymore. Azariah watched the officer approach through the rearview mirror attached to his chair handle. He noted everything: the aggressive, wide-legged stride, the flushed complexion, the flared nostrils, the way Jenkins's jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. Azariah had profiled thousands of violent offenders during his federal career. He could read the signs of escalating aggression the way other people read a book. He recognized a man high on his own artificial authority instantly. A cold, analytical part of his mind cataloged the officer's body language, his breathing pattern, the way his hand kept drifting toward his weapon. This man was dangerous. Not because he was evil, but because he was afraid. Fear, mixed with authority and prejudice, created a volatile combination. That had destroyed countless lives. Azariah made a decision in that moment. He would not make this worse. He would remain calm. He would be respectful. He would do everything right. Follow every rule, and hope that would be enough. It would not be enough. Officer Jenkins approached the wheelchair with his chest puffed out, his entire body radiating hostility. Miller watched from the cruiser, his hand still braced against the dashboard, his heart pounding against his ribs. This was not what Jenkins had taught him about. This was something different, something darker. "Step out of the road," Jenkins commanded, his voice loud enough that pedestrians nearby began to slow down, to notice, to pull out their phones. "You're blocking traffic." "Officer, I'm just cleaning up a spill," Azariah replied calmly, his voice steady and measured. He gestured toward the honey and glass. "I'll be out of your way in just a moment." "I didn't ask for an explanation. I asked you to move," Jenkins said coldly, his eyes glinting with something sharp and dangerous. "How much have you had to drink today?" The accusation came out of nowhere, a random throw of a dart that Jenkins hoped would stick. Azariah's eyes remained level, his gaze unblinking. "I haven't had anything to drink, officer. I'm simply cleaning up after dropping a jar of honey." "You're slurring," Jenkins said, though Azariah's speech had been perfectly clear. "And you're being evasive. You're acting suspicious. That's probable cause right there." Jenkins was building a case in his mind, constructing the narrative he wanted to tell himself. "I'm going to need to see your ID." He didn't ask permission. He stepped closer, invading the space around the wheelchair, in a way that was deliberately intimidating. His shadow fell across Azariah's face. Azariah reached for the small pouch attached to his wheelchair without any sudden movements, moving slowly and deliberately so there could be no misunderstanding. He extracted his wallet and held it up, then opened it to show his driver's license. The photo showed a younger version of himself, but the face was unmistakably the same. Jenkins barely glanced at it. "Where are you coming from?" "The grocery store," Azariah answered. "I was picking up some groceries." "Which store?" "Henderson's Market." 2 blocks that way, Azariah pointed in the direction he had come from. "You live around here?" "Yes, I live 3 blocks north. I've lived here for 10 years. Jenkins's eyes narrowed. This wasn't matching his narrative. A man with a valid ID, a valid address in town, a simple explanation. But Jenkins didn't care about facts. Facts were just obstacles to the story he wanted to tell. "I've never seen you before," Jenkins said, as if his own personal observation of the neighborhood was a more reliable source of truth than a government-issued ID. "What's your name?" "Azariah Hughes." "Hughes. That a common name where you're from?" "I'm from Washington, D.C. originally, but I've lived here for a decade." D.C. Jenkins said the 2 letters like they tasted bad. "You know what D.C. stands for? Crime capital. You come up here causing problems." Azariah could feel the situation deteriorating, could see the logic collapsing under the weight of Jenkins's prejudice. He had seen this pattern before, in interviews with countless criminals and abusers. When someone had already decided who you were, no amount of evidence to the contrary would change their mind. They would simply keep asking questions until they found something. Anything they could twist into guilt. "Officer, I don't want any trouble," Azariah said. "I'm going to head back home now. Thank you for your time." He reached for the joystick to move his wheelchair forward, to remove himself from the situation. "Did I say you could move?" Jenkins's voice was sharp. "Commanding. You stay right there. You're acting nervous." "That's another sign. You know how many reports we get about break-ins in this neighborhood? You know how many times seniors get scammed. You fit the pattern. You're suspicious." "What pattern?" Azariah asked, unable to hide his confusion. "I live here." "Exactly. That's what makes it suspicious. A man your age suddenly living in a nice neighborhood, no visible means of support that I can see." "I'm retired," Azariah said quietly, from what Jenkins demanded. "You retired from what exactly?" The question hung in the air. Azariah could see exactly where this was going. He could see the trap closing. If he said he worked for the federal government, Jenkins would find some way to twist that into evidence of his guilt. If he said he worked in private security, Jenkins would claim that was a cover. There was no answer Azariah could give that would satisfy this man, because this man's mind was already made up. "I worked for a federal agency for 30 years, Azariah said. "I'm retired now." Jenkins's eyes flashed with something dark. Not anger exactly, but something uglier. Recognition of the kind he didn't want. The kind that suggested he might be dealing with someone with actual authority. But Jenkins had spent a decade learning how to push back against authority, how to use his badge to level the playing field, how to make sure nobody was above him. What federal agency Jenkins pressed? "The FBI," Azariah said, and immediately realized it was a mistake. Not a mistake in terms of truth, but a mistake in terms of strategy. Jenkins' face twisted into something ugly. FBI, right. And I'm the president. You're lying now. That's worse than before. Lying to a police officer. He pulled out his citation book, his movements sharp and decisive. I'm writing you up for obstructing traffic. That's a $50 fine. And I'm writing you up for failure to provide identification when requested. I provided identification, Azariah said calmly. You saw my driver's license. You provided a document you claim is identification. Doesn't mean it's valid. Could be forged. I'll need to verify it, Jenkins said. Jenkins was building his case now, using his citation book like a weapon. Each scratch of his pen was a small assault. And I'm writing you for suspicious behavior and trespassing. Trespassing, I live in this neighborhood, officer. You claim you live in this neighborhood. I haven't verified that yet, so until I do, you're trespassing. Those are the rules, Jenkins said flatly. You're also going to need to submit to a sobriety test, given your behavior and your refusal to cooperate. By now, a crowd had gathered. 5 people, then 10, then more. Everyone pulling out their phones, recording the interaction. A woman in a sundress was filming from near the corner. A young man with a skateboard stood about 20 feet away. His phone held steady. An elderly couple had stopped on the sidewalk, watching with expressions of horror and disbelief. Miller, still in the cruiser, was pale. He wanted to say something. He wanted to tell his training officer that this was wrong, that this was exactly the kind of behavior they had been warned about in the academy. But he said nothing. He was too young, too new, too afraid of Jenkins's response if he spoke up again. Azariah submitted to the sobriety test, which he passed with no difficulty. He walked a line, touched his nose, recited the alphabet forward and backward. Jenkins watched with barely concealed disappointment, as if he had been actually hoping that Azariah would stumble, that Azariah would give him justification for arrest. But Azariah passed every test, and still Jenkins wasn't finished. You know what I'm not done here, Jenkins said, his eyes glinting with something sharp and dangerous. I need to search your wheelchair. You could be carrying weapons. You could be carrying stolen merchandise from that store you claim you visited. Officer, you don't have probable cause. Azariah began. I have probable cause, Jenkins said coldly. You're acting suspicious. You're in a disabled vehicle that could be concealing weapons or contraband. I have the right to conduct a pat-down and a search of your bag. He didn't ask permission. He simply reached for the canvas bag on Azariah's lap, his thick fingers grasping it roughly. Inside were a newspaper, the fresh basil, some tea, and a greeting card Azariah had picked up for his neighbor's birthday. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious, nothing to justify the search. Jenkins pawed through the items with the contempt of someone handling garbage. He held up the greeting card, looked at it for 3 seconds, then tossed it back into the bag with disgust. This is over, he announced. You're free to go. But I'm keeping these citations, and I'm running your information through the system. If you're lying about any of this, about where you live, about your background, about anything, I'll be back. And it won't be pleasant. He turned and walked back to his cruiser, his stride aggressive, his posture radiating the satisfaction of someone who had exercised power for the sake of exercising power. He had accomplished nothing except to humiliate an elderly man for the crime of existing in public while disabled and black. Miller said nothing as Jenkins climbed back into the driver's seat. Neither of them spoke as they pulled away, the cruiser accelerating down the street with unnecessary force. Azariah sat in the middle of the intersection, his heart pounding despite his outward calm. He was shaking now, not from fear, but from rage. a controlled analytical rage that had learned over 30 years in federal law enforcement to express itself quietly. He picked up the remaining items from his shopping, put them back in his bag, and continued on his way. The people who had been recording approached him with offers of support, asking if he was okay, if he needed them to file a report. Azariah thanked them politely but declined. He had dealt with law enforcement corruption before. He knew how these systems worked. He knew that a video and some witnesses wouldn't be enough. He knew that Jenkins had the backing of a department that would protect him. What Azariah didn't know was that his decision not to escalate the situation immediately would become the most crucial moment of his life. Not because he was right to remain calm. He was. But because Jenkins was about to make a mistake that would change everything. Officer Jenkins couldn't let it go. That night, sitting at home in his apartment above a laundromat, Jenkins found himself replaying the interaction over and over in his mind. The disabled black man in the wheelchair, the FBI claim, the calm responses, the sobriety tests passed perfectly, the video footage he knew would be on social media by morning. Jenkins opened his laptop and did something he would later regret more than anything else he had done in his career. He ran Azariah Hughes' name through every database he had access to. Not because there was any reason to suspect criminality, but because Jenkins needed to find something, anything, that would justify his behavior. What he found terrified him. Azariah Hughes had worked for the FBI for 30 years. His employment records were sealed, but his name appeared in files related to major organized crime cases, international terrorism investigations, money laundering operations. The more Jenkins dug, the more he realized that the man he had humiliated in the street was not some random retiree. He was someone important, someone with connections, someone with authority. Jenkins's fear quickly transformed into aggression. In his mind, the narrative shifted. Azariah wasn't a victim. Azariah was a threat. Azariah might actually be involved in something illegal, some federal operation that Jenkins didn't understand. By harassing Azariah, Jenkins reasoned he might actually be on to something significant. He decided to double down. The next morning, Jenkins filed a report stating that he had conducted a routine traffic stop on a suspicious individual matching the description of a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. He claimed that Azariah had been evasive, belligerent, potentially in possession of contraband. He requested that the FBI be notified to verify Azariah's employment history. It was a request that would backfire spectacularly. Within hours, Jenkins's sergeant was called into a meeting with Chief Harrison. The sergeant brought the citation and the report. Chief Harrison read them carefully, his expression growing darker with each line. "This is bullshit," Harrison said quietly, which was his way of expressing rage. "This is exactly the kind of garbage I told you to watch out for. Where is your body cam footage?" "I wasn't wearing it," Jenkins said. Which was partially true. Jenkins had somehow forgotten his body cam that day. "A convenient malfunction." "Of course you weren't," Harrison said. "Run me through this interaction step by step. What probable cause did you have to stop him?" "He was blocking traffic," Jenkins said. "He was cleaning up something he dropped. That's not blocking traffic. That's a momentary inconvenience," Harrison replied flatly. "He was acting suspicious," Jenkins continued. Doubling down, his behavior was evasive. "His behavior was perfectly legal," Harrison said. "And now you're filing reports claiming he's a person of interest in some investigation." "What investigation? You're not working organized crime. You're not working terrorism. You're working traffic enforcement and minor misdemeanors." But his background, Jenkins began. "His background is none of your concern," Harrison interrupted. "And you know what? I just got a call from the FBI field office. They want to know why a local officer is filing reports about one of their former agents." They want to know why that agent was harassed in the street without cause. They want to know why there's no body cam footage. And now I have to explain all of that to them." Jenkins's face went pale. He could see the situation spiraling. He could see his career teetering on the edge of a cliff. "I was just doing my job, Chief. If he's a former Fed, he knows how these things work. He should have cooperated more fully." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Jenkins with an expression of profound disappointment. "You know what your problem is, Jenkins. You can't tell the difference between authority and power. Authority comes from doing your job correctly. Power comes from abusing your position. You've been abusing your position for 6 years. "I have 14 commendations," Jenkins said desperately. "You have 14 complaints that I don't have enough evidence to support," Harrison replied. "But I'm building a file," and this Harrison held up the citation report. "This is exactly the kind of thing that's going to be in that file." Jenkins left the office humiliated, but also determined. If the FBI was getting involved, then Jenkins needed to protect himself. He needed to make sure that his story was the only story that mattered. He called his union representative. He requested that the department issue a formal statement supporting his investigation. He tried to frame the entire situation as a misunderstanding that had gotten blown out of proportion. What Jenkins didn't realize was that he was no longer in control of the narrative. The video of his interaction with Azariah was already spreading across social media. It had been uploaded by the woman in the sundress, and it showed everything. Jenkins's aggression, Azariah's calm, the humiliation, the search, the citations for nothing. The comments section was filling up with outrage. By noon, the story had been picked up by local news outlets. By evening, it was national. By the next morning, civil rights organizations were calling for Jenkins's firing. The police department issued a statement saying that the interaction was still under review and that they took all complaints seriously. Chief Harrison launched an internal affairs investigation. And Azariah, sitting at home with his morning coffee, watched the world become aware of what had happened to him. His phone began ringing. Friends called, colleagues from his federal days called, reporters called. A civil rights attorney called, offering to represent him pro bono. Azariah declined most of them. He was not someone who sought attention. He was not someone who enjoyed being at the center of a controversy. But the universe apparently had other plans. 2 weeks after the initial interaction, Chief Harrison scheduled a meeting in his office with Azariah. The civil rights attorney Azariah had eventually hired a woman named Margaret Chen and himself. Officer Jenkins was not present. Harrison would not allow Jenkins in the same room as Azariah without witnesses present. Harrison began the meeting by apologizing. Not a corporate apology, a real one. "Mr. Hughes, I want you to know that Officer Jenkins's conduct was completely unacceptable. It violated departmental policy. It violated your rights as a citizen, and it reflected poorly on this entire department. I have initiated a full investigation into his conduct, and I am recommending termination." The attorney Margaret Chen leaned forward. "Chief Harrison, I appreciate that, but termination isn't going to be enough. My client was publicly humiliated. His reputation has been affected. There are legal remedies we need to discuss." "I'm prepared to offer a settlement," Harrison said. "And more than that, I'm prepared to make this case a catalyst for departmental reform. We're going to implement body camera requirements for all traffic stops. We're going to implement bias training. We're going to implement a civilian review board." "With subpoena power?" Chen asked, her eyes sharp. She knew how these things worked. She knew that review boards without power were toothless. "With subpoena power," Harrison confirmed. "I have already spoken to the city council. They're prepared to support this. The public pressure is there, and frankly, I'm tired of protecting bad officers." Azariah listened to this exchange with interest. He had expected a fight. Instead, he was getting reform. It wasn't that Jenkins's victims before him hadn't existed. It wasn't that their complaints hadn't been valid. It was that nobody with power had listened until a video went viral. until the media attention became too intense to ignore. The settlement was finalized at $150,000. Azariah donated the entire amount to the Foundation Against Police Misconduct, instructing them to use it to help other victims of false arrests and police harassment. He did not want the money. What he wanted was for this to never happen to anyone else. And then Officer Jenkins made his second great mistake. Faced with the prospect of termination, Jenkins appealed to his union. The police union hired an expensive attorney and mounted a defense, arguing that Jenkins had done nothing wrong, that he had been following departmental procedures, that the settlement was an overreaction to a routine traffic stop that had simply been misunderstood by the public. The union attorney filed a motion to prevent Jenkins's termination, and in doing so they forced the case to go to arbitration, which meant that Azariah would have to testify about what had happened, which meant that Azariah would have to relive the experience in a public hearing, which meant that the entire case would be back in the news. This was the moment when everything changed. The arbitration hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. The hearing room was packed. Media outlets sent their top reporters. Civil rights organizations sent their representatives. Other victims of Jenkins's misconduct began to surface. Stories they had kept quiet for years suddenly finding voice. Margaret Chen represented Azariah at the hearing. The union attorney represented Jenkins. An arbitrator, a retired judge named Eleanor Reeves, sat at the center, listening with the careful attention of someone who had spent her life understanding the law. Chen presented her case methodically. She presented the video evidence. She presented the testimony of the witnesses who had recorded the interaction. She presented medical records showing that Azariah was fully capable of operating his wheelchair, and that there was no evidence whatsoever of intoxication. She presented Azariah's employment records from the FBI, showing a career of distinction and service. Then she presented something the union attorney had not expected: testimony from other victims. A woman named Sandra Martinez came forward. She had been pulled over by Jenkins 5 years earlier, cited for suspicious behavior, and then let go when no charges could be brought. But the arrest record had cost her a job opportunity. A man named David Kim described being stopped by Jenkins, searched without cause, and humiliated in front of his children. An elderly woman named Ruth Patterson explained how Jenkins had harassed her at a bus stop, suggesting that she was shoplifting, even though she had nothing but her purse with her. Each story was different, but the pattern was identical. Jenkins used his authority to harass people he perceived as not belonging. He used his power to humiliate them, and he did it without consequence because the department protected him. The union attorney tried to paint these individuals as malcontents, seeking attention or revenge. But Judge Reeves was not convinced. She listened to each story with the gravity of someone who understood that these were real people describing real trauma. Then it was Azariah's turn to testify. He was sworn in. Margaret Chen asked him to describe the interaction in his own words. Azariah spoke calmly and carefully, his voice steady, his narrative clear. He described the way Jenkins had approached him, the way Jenkins had invented reasons to prolong the stop, the way Jenkins had searched his belongings without justification. "Did Officer Jenkins give you any explanation for why he was stopping you?" Chen asked. "Initially, he said I was blocking traffic," Azariah replied. "But when he realized I was simply cleaning up something I had dropped, he shifted his accusation. He suggested I was intoxicated. I passed 3 sobriety tests. Then he suggested I was suspicious. I asked him what was suspicious about a man cleaning up garbage, and he never gave me a clear answer." "In your 30 years of federal law enforcement, did you ever conduct an investigation based on such vague and shifting accusations?" Chen asked. "Never," Azariah said. "If I had conducted an investigation that way, I would have been terminated immediately. Federal law enforcement requires probable cause, reasonable suspicion, clear justification for each investigative step. Officer Jenkins appears to have adopted a different standard. The union attorney cross-examined Azariah, trying to find inconsistencies, trying to suggest that Azariah had been evasive or uncooperative. But Azariah's testimony was rock solid. He had been completely truthful. He had cooperated fully. He had been treated with hostility despite doing nothing wrong. Judge Reeves listened carefully to everything, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. And then, 3 days after the hearing concluded, she issued her ruling. The ruling was devastating to Jenkins. Judge Reeves found that Officer Jenkins had engaged in harassment, had conducted a search without probable cause, and had violated multiple departmental policies. But the most damaging finding was this. Judge Reeves found that Jenkins's conduct appeared to be motivated, at least in part, by racial bias. The evidence suggests Judge Reeves wrote in her formal order that Officer Jenkins was predisposed to view Mr. Hughes as a threat based on his race, and that this predisposition led him to perceive innocent behavior as suspicious, and to interpret neutral responses as hostile. This reflects a pattern of behavior that is inconsistent with the standards required of law enforcement officers. Based on this finding, Judge Reeves upheld the police department's decision to terminate Jenkins's employment. The ruling was final. Jenkins had no further recourse. His career as a police officer was over. The news broke at 10 in the morning on a Thursday. By noon, it was the lead story on every local news outlet. By evening, it was on national news. Officer Bradley Jenkins, the man who had humiliated Azariah Hughes, was fired for racial harassment and abuse of authority, and then the aftermath began. With Jenkins's employment officially terminated, the question became what would happen to him next. That answer came in the form of criminal charges. The district attorney, a woman named Victoria Santos, who had been watching the case unfold in the press, decided to prosecute Jenkins for filing a false report and abuse of authority. These were serious charges. Abuse of authority was a felony. If convicted, Jenkins was looking at potential prison time. But more importantly, Jenkins was now facing the consequences of his actions in a way that extended far beyond losing his job. He was facing the legal system the way his victims had faced it. He was experiencing the powerlessness of being accused, the vulnerability of not knowing how the system would respond. Jenkins' trial was scheduled for the fall, but before the trial, something extraordinary happened. A journalist named Thomas Webb, working for a national news organization, decided to do a deep dive into Officer Jenkins's career. Webb obtained court records, police records, internal affairs reports, and what he found was worse than anyone had suspected. Over his 16-year career with the police department, Jenkins had been involved in multiple questionable shootings, several accusations of planting evidence, and at least a dozen complaints about excessive force. And almost all of these cases involved minorities, primarily Black and Hispanic individuals. But what made Webb's investigation truly explosive was what he discovered about Jenkins's finances. During the years when Jenkins had been most active in making arrests, he had somehow accumulated significant additional income. He had a boat. He had a luxury car. He had recently taken a vacation to the Caribbean that would have been impossible on a police officer's salary. Webb traced this money and found something shocking. Jenkins had been taking bribes. Drug dealers had been paying Jenkins to look the other way. Jenkins had been selling information about police operations to people involved in crime. Jenkins hadn't just been abusing his authority, he had been actively profiting from it. The revelation was staggering. The district attorney's case suddenly expanded dramatically. In addition to filing a false report and abuse of authority, Jenkins was now facing charges of bribery, corruption, and conspiracy. The press coverage became intense. National news outlets picked up the story. Civil rights organizations called it a symbol of corruption. Police reform advocates pointed to it as evidence that the entire system needed to be restructured. And then, unexpectedly, Azariah Hughes became the face of accountability. News outlets and civil rights organizations began asking Azariah to speak publicly about his experience. At first, he declined. He was not comfortable with attention. He was not someone who sought the spotlight. But his attorney, Margaret Chen, convinced him that his voice mattered, that his willingness to speak could inspire others to come forward, that his experience could be a catalyst for change. So Azariah agreed. His first public appearance was at a press conference organized by the National Foundation Against Police Misconduct. He stood at a podium with microphones in front of him, cameras pointed at his face, and he spoke about what had happened to him. "I spent 30 years working in federal law enforcement because I believed in the rule of law," Azariah began, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. "I believed that we had systems in place to protect people, to ensure that authority was exercised responsibly, and that injustice would be addressed. What happened to me on that Tuesday afternoon shook my faith in those systems. Not because one officer acted badly. There are bad people in every profession. But because the system protected him. The system allowed him to continue harassing people for years. The system only responded when I had the privilege of a viral video, when I had the resources to hire an attorney, when I had the credibility of a federal background. How many people without those advantages has Officer Jenkins harassed? How many have suffered in silence? How many have simply accepted that this is how the system works? I'm speaking today because I can, because I have a platform, because I have the resources to fight. But I want to be clear. My experience should not be exceptional. The fact that I had to fight to get justice means the system is broken. We need to fix it, not for people like me, for everyone." The speech went viral. It was shared millions of times on social media. It was discussed on news programs and talk shows. And most importantly, it inspired others to come forward. Over the next few weeks, more than 30 individuals came forward claiming that Jenkins had harassed them. Some of these people had criminal records and had been dismissed initially. Others were like Azariah, people with clean records who had been victimized simply for existing in public in a way that offended Jenkins's sensibilities. One woman named Keisha Johnson described how Jenkins had pulled her over, suggested she was a prostitute based on what she was wearing, and then arrested her for obstruction when she refused to submit to a search of her car. The charges had been dropped, but the arrest record had cost her a teaching position. Another man named Michael Torres described how Jenkins had stopped him in a grocery store parking lot, accused him of being a drug dealer, and only let him go after 30 minutes of degrading questioning. A teenager named Marcus Williams described how Jenkins had stopped him while walking home from school, detained him for an hour, and only released him when his mother arrived at the scene. Each story added to the picture of a law enforcement officer who had systematically abused his authority, and each story made Jenkins's legal situation worse. When the trial finally began, the prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented the financial evidence showing Jenkins's illegal income. They presented testimony from drug dealers who claimed they had paid Jenkins for protection. They presented the pattern of disproportionate harassment of minorities. They presented witness after witness describing Jenkins's abusive behavior. The defense attorney tried to argue that Jenkins was simply doing his job, that he was perhaps overzealous but not criminal. But the evidence was too strong. After 4 weeks of trial, the jury took only 3 days to deliberate before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Officer Bradley Jenkins was convicted of bribery, corruption, abuse of authority, and filing false reports. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison. Jenkins's career was not just over. His freedom was taken away. 6 months after Jenkins's conviction, Azariah Hughes stood in front of the same intersection where the incident had occurred. The grass on Elm Street had grown taller. The neighborhood looked the same. But something had changed. Azariah had changed. The community had changed. The police department had changed. Chief Harrison had launched a complete reform of the department's policies. Body cameras were now mandatory for all traffic stops. All stops were now recorded, and the footage was reviewed by supervisors before any citations were issued. A civilian review board with actual investigative power had been established, and all officers were now required to complete training on implicit bias and racial equity. The changes weren't perfect. No system ever is. But they represented a genuine commitment to accountability and reform, and they had come about because one man, disabled, retired, just trying to get home safely on a Tuesday afternoon, had encountered injustice and refused to accept it. Azariah rolled his wheelchair across the intersection, the same path he had taken on that Tuesday afternoon that felt like a lifetime ago. A woman approaching from the opposite direction nodded to him as she passed. A police cruiser drove by, and the officer inside gave him a small wave. Not the aggressive acknowledgement of someone asserting dominance, but the genuine greeting of someone who recognized him as a member of the community. That evening, Azariah was invited to speak at the local college, sharing his story with a class of criminal justice students. The students listened intently as Azariah described what had happened, not as a lesson in what had gone wrong, but as a catalyst for understanding what needed to change. The system is not inherently evil, Azariah told the students, but it can be corrupted by people who allow prejudice to guide their actions. Officer Jenkins wasn't unique. He was simply more visible than others. The question isn't how to eliminate people like Jenkins, though that would be ideal. The question is how to create systems that don't allow people like Jenkins to operate unchecked. How do we build accountability into the foundation rather than adding it on after the fact? One student raised her hand. Do you think your case would have gotten the attention it did if you hadn't had resources? If you hadn't had a video? If you hadn't had an attorney? Azariah nodded solemnly. Probably not. And that's the real injustice. There are countless people who have experienced what I experienced, and never received justice because they didn't have those advantages. That's why the policy changes matter. That's why the accountability matters, because it protects people who don't have viral videos or expensive attorneys. Weeks later, the state legislature passed what was informally called the Azariah Hughes Police Accountability Act, though Azariah himself objected to having his name on it. "It's not about me," he said in an interview. "It's about the people who came forward. It's about Sandra Martinez and David Kim and Ruth Patterson and all the others whose stories enabled this change. I was fortunate enough to have a platform. They should be the ones remembered." The law required all police departments in the state to implement body cameras, to conduct quarterly audits of arrest records for racial disparities, to establish civilian review boards with investigative power, and to implement mandatory bias training. It also created a fund to provide legal representation to individuals who claimed they had been victims of police misconduct. Azariah, using the settlement money he had donated to the Foundation Against Police Misconduct, worked with the foundation to expand their legal services. More people who had been victimized by officers like Jenkins now had access to representation. More people could fight back. More people could get justice. 1 year after Jenkins's conviction, Azariah received a call from Margaret Chen, his attorney. "The city council wants to honor you," Chen said. "They're creating the Azariah Hughes Community Safety Award to be given annually to an individual or organization that has made significant contributions to police accountability and community trust." "I don't want an award," Azariah said, though his voice contained gratitude rather than objection. "I know you don't," Chen replied, "but you're getting one anyway, because your willingness to fight, your refusal to accept injustice, inspired change that will protect countless people you'll never meet. That's worth honoring." The award ceremony took place on a warm evening in spring. The mayor was there, city council members were there, Chief Harrison was there, and he was visibly moved by the ceremony. But most importantly, the other victims were there. Sandra Martinez stood up and spoke about how the reforms had given her hope. David Kim talked about how the Civilian Review Board had reopened his case and expunged his arrest record. Ruth Patterson, now 83 years old, described how the policy changes made her feel safe in her own neighborhood again. And Azariah, sitting in his wheelchair at the center of it all, realized something he hadn't understood before, that his personal suffering had created a space for collective healing. His refusal to accept injustice had given others permission to refuse it too. As the sun set over the city, Azariah reflected on the journey. It had not been easy. The attention had been unwelcome at times. The legal battle had been exhausting. But the outcome, the policy changes, the accountability, the sense that the system had been forced to improve, made it worthwhile. A young woman approached him after the ceremony. She couldn't have been more than 25, with eyes that held a mixture of hope and determination. "Mr. Hughes, I'm a police officer," she said. "I just graduated from the academy last month. I joined the force because of your story, because I saw what Officer Jenkins did, and I saw how the system had to be forced to respond. And I realized that I wanted to be part of building a better system. I wanted to be part of the change you created." Azariah reached out and shook her hand. Her grip was firm. Her eyes were clear. She was not Jenkins. She was something different. She was someone who had seen injustice and decided to dedicate her life to preventing it. "That's all any of us can do," Azariah said quietly. "See what's wrong, refuse to accept it, and work to make it better. Thank you for choosing that path." 2 years after Officer Bradley Jenkins's initial encounter with Azariah Hughes, Jenkins was released from federal prison after serving his full sentence. He was a broken man. His reputation was destroyed. His career was over. His freedom had been taken away. But more than that, he had become a symbol. In police academies across the nation, instructors used Jenkins's case as a cautionary tale. "This is what happens," they told recruits, "when you let bias guide your authority. This is what happens when you forget that the badge is a responsibility, not a license." Jenkins never worked in law enforcement again. He lived a quiet, anonymous life, forever marked by the consequences of his own actions. For Azariah Hughes, life continued in its new configuration. The settlement money was distributed to causes he believed in. The platform he had been given was used to advocate for change. And the wound he had experienced, the injustice of being harassed, humiliated, and threatened by someone whose only power came from the authority society had granted him, became the fuel for a movement. Other states adopted versions of the Azariah Hughes Police Accountability Act. Other departments implemented reforms. Other victims came forward, and slowly, incrementally, the system began to change. It wasn't perfect. Change never is. But it was real, and it had come about because one man, disabled, retired, just trying to get home safely on a Tuesday afternoon, had encountered injustice and refused to accept it. As Azariah sat on his porch on a warm evening watching the sun set over Oak Ridge, he thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the humiliation, the fight, the victory, the ongoing work of building a better system. His neighbor, the young mother he had observed on that first day, walked by with her daughter, who was now old enough to walk beside her mother without holding her hand. "Good evening, Mr. Hughes," the neighbor said warmly. "Good evening," Azariah replied, returning the greeting with genuine warmth. It was just another evening in Oak Ridge, but Azariah knew that something fundamental had shifted. The town was safer now, not because crime had decreased, but because the people who had power had been forced to use it more responsibly, because accountability had been built into the system, because one man's refusal to accept injustice had opened a door that could never be closed again. As darkness fell and the crickets began their evening song, Azariah thought about the students he spoke to, about the young police officer who had told him she joined because of his story, about all the people whose lives were being changed by the reforms that his experience had catalyzed. He thought about the words he had spoken at the college. The system is not inherently evil, but it can be corrupted by people who allow prejudice to guide their actions. And he thought about what he had come to understand. That fighting back against injustice wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about creating a world where fewer people would have to fight back. It was about building systems that prevented injustice before it happened, rather than simply punishing it after the fact. The screen door opened behind him, and his neighbor, who had called him a friend many times, came out with 2 cups of tea. "Thought you might like some company," the neighbor said, sitting down in the chair beside Azariah. "I would," Azariah replied, accepting the tea gratefully. They sat together in the darkness, 2 neighbors in a town that had been forced to confront its own capacity for injustice, and in that confrontation had begun to transform itself. The change was incomplete, the work was ongoing, but the direction was clear, and that was what mattered. Above them, stars emerged in the darkening sky, and in the distance the lights of the city glowed with the promise of a future slightly more just than the present, slightly more accountable than the past. If this story meant something to you, if it opened your eyes to the reality that injustice can happen anywhere to anyone regardless of their background or accomplishments, then please subscribe to our channel, because stories like this one need to be heard, not just for clicks or views, but because patterns only change when people refuse to look away. Your voice matters. Your refusal to accept injustice matters. The systems that protect abuse will only fall when we build a collective conscience strong enough to demand better. Azariah Hughes chose to fight. He chose to speak. And in doing so, he changed the trajectory of countless lives he would never meet. That power exists in all of us. The question is whether we will use it. Subscribe to our channel and become part of a community dedicated to uncovering the stories that change systems. Because the next time you see an injustice, you'll remember Azariah's story. You'll remember that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always comes out. And you'll remember that your voice, combined with others, is powerful enough to transform the world.